They were worshipped as gods, draped in gold and buried in tombs the size of mountains. But behind the divine titles and the shimmering crowns, the life of a pharaoh was anything but serene. It was a life watched, controlled, and haunted, not just by enemies and betrayal, but by an obsession with death so consuming that their entire reign became one long preparation for the grave. This isn't the Egypt of schoolbooks. This is the quiet, unsettling truth beneath the stone. In the grand halls of ancient Egypt, beneath towering columns etched with the names of gods, a child would be born, not merely into royalty, but into divinity. This child, destined to become Pharaoh, was not seen as just a ruler or a king. He was a god in human form, the earthly embodiment of Horus, later transforming into Osiris upon death. From the very moment of birth, his life ceased to belong to him. It was a life shaped not by curiosity or innocence, but by prophecy, ritual, and the heavy burden of perfection. The infant Pharaoh was swaddled in linen finer than what most adults in the kingdom would ever touch. The cradle wasn't just a cradle. It was symbolic, wrapped in myth, an echo of stories about creation and divine lineage. His first breath wasn't just a gasp of life. It was, to the people, a divine whisper from the gods themselves. But in the eyes of the court and the priests, this child was never merely a baby. He was a vessel, a sacred shell expected to embody cosmic order mad and keep chaos at bay. Before he could walk, his destiny was already carved in stone. Education began alarmingly early, not just in literacy or administration, but in sacred texts, royal etiquette, and the cryptic language of the priests. Where other children played in the mud by the Nile, the young Pharaoh, in training, sat in echoing chambers, repeating hymns to gods he was told were his ancestors. The air was always thick with incense and expectation. Every gesture he made, every word he spoke, was scrutinized. Smiling too freely could be seen as undignified. Crying in public was unacceptable. Play was limited, spontaneity frowned upon. He was not allowed to be a boy. He had to be a symbol. There was no mother or father in the traditional sense. Royal parenting was distant. Affection was replaced by protocol. Even his mother, often called the great royal wife, had to observe decorum, addressing her own son as divine once he reached a certain age. His caregivers were priests, scribes, astrologers, and officials. Every person in his presence had a role, a script, and most had ambitions of their own. He was raised in a golden cage where smiles hid schemes and silence often screamed louder than words. In public, he was paraded through temple courtyards and palace balconies to thunderous chants and orchestrated cheers. The people believed they were witnessing a god, but behind closed doors, he was a child stripped of privacy, overwhelmed by layers of tradition he couldn't question. If he laughed too loudly during rituals, it was considered a bad omen. If he stumbled while walking past the sacred ibis, someone could lose their life in punishment. There was always someone watching. Always, discipline was firm and sometimes cruel. Any sign of rebellion, any desire to escape the suffocating expectations, was crushed, not by open violence, but by spiritual guilt and societal shame. Priests reminded him daily that he was the axis of the universe, the one who held the stars in balance, and any defiance could invite divine punishment upon all of Egypt. Imagine the weight of that. To be told that if you misbehaved, crops would fail, floods would come, and your people would starve. Childhood for a pharaoh was not about growth, but about performance. It was theater at the highest level, costumed in gold and guarded by gods. And yet, beneath all the titles, there was still a heartbeat. There were moments when the young pharaoh might sneak out into a quiet corridor, away from the chants and oil lamps, and stare at the moon through a slit in the stone wall. Moments when he might hear laughter from servants' quarters and wonder what freedom felt like. He may have envied the fisherman's son, splashing in the Nile, unaware of cosmic balance or royal decrees. But envy had no place in divine flesh. Emotions were to be buried, just like the peasants buried their dead. What's disturbing isn't just how much was expected of these children. It's how little room they were given to be human. To cry over a scraped knee, to shout in joy, to ask why. These things were not allowed. From the very beginning, the pharaoh was made to believe that his desires were irrelevant, that his body belonged to tradition and his soul belonged to the gods. Even his name was chosen not for affection, but for legacy, meaning, and power. Often, multiple names were bestowed upon him, each representing a different divine role, as if one identity wasn't enough to contain him. And when he finally ascended the throne, still barely a teenager in some cases, the transformation was complete. He was no longer seen as a boy. He was the sun itself, the eye of Ra watching the world. But the child inside, the one who once looked at the moon in silence, was long buried beneath layers of ceremony and expectation. That child never had a chance to live, only to perform. So while history remembers the pharaohs in glittering hieroglyphs and towering monuments, behind every stone is a ghost of a childhood sacrificed, a divine ruler who was never truly free, not even for a moment. The life of a pharaoh was wrapped in grandeur, gleaming gold, divine status, eternal praise. But beneath all that shimmered was a life bound tightly in ritual, isolation, and suffocating order. From sunrise to sunset, the pharaoh's day was a meticulous performance. Every step he took, every garment he wore, every word he uttered had meaning, spiritual meaning, political weight, and often a complete lack of personal freedom. To outsiders, it looked like majesty, but to the man beneath the headdress, it was a relentless cycle of expectations, superstitions, and duties he never chose. His mornings began in silence, not because it was peaceful, but because everything had to be done according to sacred timing. Even waking up was a ritual act. The pharaoh did not simply rise from bed. He was reborn each morning, mirroring the sun god Ra's daily journey across the sky. Priests would enter his chambers already purified and ritually clean to prepare the divine body. He was bathed in scented water collected from sacred pools, anointed with oils imported from distant lands, and dressed in layers of linen that symbolized purity and cosmic order. Not a thread was chosen for comfort. It all had meaning. A specific bracelet might represent protection from Seth, the god of chaos. A certain color of cloth might be chosen to reflect power, rebirth, or fertility. To wear something incorrectly was not a fashion mistake, it was a spiritual violation. He didn't eat when hungry. Meals were scheduled, offerings more than indulgences. The food itself, dates, figs, bread, meats, and beer, was first presented to the gods, then consumed by the living god, the pharaoh. It wasn't about appetite, it was about ceremony. Nothing in his day existed just to satisfy a personal need. Everything was symbolic. Even chewing a bite of meat had to occur at a time deemed auspicious by court astrologers. The palace was a labyrinth of courtyards, altars, perfumed halls, and waiting attendants. But for all its opulence, it was a place of constraint. The pharaoh could not simply walk outside and feel the breeze or stroll through the gardens. His movements were tracked, approved, and choreographed. If he were to visit a temple or inspect a project along the Nile, dozens of officials had to prepare the route. Offerings had to be made beforehand. The location had to be ritually cleansed. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was a ritualized production. One of the most confining aspects of this life was the endless series of religious obligations. The pharaoh was not merely expected to believe in the gods. He had to embody their will. Daily, he performed rituals at the temples or delegated them to high priests who acted in his name. Sometimes he would strike a ceremonial pose, raising a mace over the bound figure of a foreign enemy carved into stone, symbolizing divine victory. Sometimes he would light incense, pour sacred oils, or chant invocations known only to those initiated into the mysteries. These acts were not optional. The people believed that if the pharaoh failed to uphold these duties, the world could unravel. Crops might fail, the Nile might not rise, illness and disorder would spread. His life wasn't just his own, it was a cosmic linchpin holding the universe together. priests held enormous power, and while the pharaoh was technically their superior, in practice, he was often their puppet. These men, guardians of temple knowledge and keepers of ritual, were the interpreters of signs and omens. They controlled the calendar, the rituals, the meanings behind dreams. If a certain bird flew left instead of right, or if the stars aligned strangely, the pharaoh might be advised to delay travel, cancel a decree, or conduct an emergency offering. His will was constantly filtered through their divine interpretations. Even if he disagreed, even if he wanted to ignore their signs, doing so risked spiritual disaster and political fallout, and always there were eyes. Attendants shadowed him wherever he went. He was surrounded by guards, servants, scribes, and whispering advisors. Privacy was non-existent. He could not grieve openly. He could not confide in someone without fear of it becoming public. Even in the harem, among his wives and concubines, there was competition, hierarchy, and power plays. Nothing was pure. Nothing was simple. Everything was watched. When he sat on the throne, a grand seat made of ebony, gold, and ivory, it wasn't for rest. It was for appearances. The throne itself was a stage. Audiences were held not for connection, but for control. Foreign diplomats bowed low. Nobles presented tributes. Scribes recorded every word, gesture, and moment. Even his facial expressions were dissected for meaning. If he frowned, people wondered whether it meant war. If he smiled, rumors might spread of new decrees. There was no margin for error, no space to simply exist as a man. The throne was a burden disguised as glory. At night, after layers of ritual, meals of symbolic importance, temple visits, and court decisions, the pharaoh would retreat to his chamber, not necessarily for rest, but to prepare for more rituals. The stars above had to be observed, astrological meanings had to be interpreted. Sometimes ceremonies extended long into the night under torchlight as hymns echoed through stone corridors. Even his sleep was sacred. Dreams were believed to be messages from the gods, and so his dreams, too, were not his own. If he dreamt of fire, it might mean rebellion. If he dreamt of a crocodile, it could mean treachery in the palace. His inner world was mind translated and used to direct political and religious decisions. In many ways, the pharaoh lived in a prison made of gold. Yes, he had wealth, land, and reverence, but he had no freedom, no ease, and no escape. He was the most visible man in the kingdom, yet the most isolated, a being surrounded by voices, yet starved of truth, and perhaps the cruelest irony of all, he was seen by millions, yet never truly known by anyone. Inside the magnificent walls of the pharaoh's palace, life appeared lavish and serene. Gold-inlaid columns, polished alabaster floors, and murals of gods and victories adorned every corner. But beneath this exterior of divine splendor simmered a volatile world of secrecy, rivalry, and manipulation. The pharaoh may have been the supreme ruler of Egypt, but he was not surrounded by peace. His home was not a sanctuary, it was a stage, and every actor, whether wife, servant, or advisor, had a role to play and a scheme to advance. The royal harem was perhaps the most misunderstood part of his private world. Often romanticized as a sensual paradise, the harem was in truth a politically charged maze of shifting alliances, rivalries, and hidden agendas. It housed not only the pharaoh's wives and concubines, but also his daughters, noble women sent by foreign kings to seal treaties, and generations of servants, eunuchs, and guards. Every woman in the harem had her own ambitions, and every child born within its confines had the potential to become a threat or a pawn. A smile from one concubine could spark envy in another. A whispered conversation could become ammunition for a future betrayal. Marriage for a pharaoh was not about love. It was about power, diplomacy, and bloodline. The great royal wife held the most prestigious position, but even she was not immune to suspicion or downfall. Other wives, often of noble or foreign origin, competed constantly for influence. Bearing a son elevated a woman's status, but it also painted a target on her back. Jealousy brewed in hushed tones, poisoned gifts, and subtle gestures. The palace was a web, and one misstep could cost everything. Concubines, though lower in rank, were not without influence. A favored concubine could become a trusted advisor, a whisper in the pharaoh's ear when the court fell silent. But with favor came danger. Rivals would look for any excuse to discredit or eliminate a woman who rose too quickly. Accusations of witchcraft, treason, or impurity could be weaponized, and with little evidence, lives could end quietly in the shadows of the palace. The pharaoh himself was not immune to paranoia. Surrounded by courtiers who flattered his every word and wives who smiled while plotting behind curtains, he had to remain constantly vigilant. Trust was a rare currency, and even those closest to him could turn into enemies overnight. Advisors shifted with the winds of palace gossip. Servants could be bribed. Spies were everywhere. Some acted in the name of priests, others for foreign interests. Some simply wanted power for themselves. Even children were not spared from this cold atmosphere. Sons of different mothers were pitted against each other long before they understood the stakes. Each mother groomed her son to be the heir, whispering promises of destiny and planting seeds of ambition. Brothers grew up not as companions but as competitors. Some were sent away to distant temples or border cities under the pretense of duty, but often it was exile in disguise, a way to neutralize threats before they bloomed. Mothers, desperate to secure their child's future, might poison rivals, forge omens, or manipulate priests. A well-timed rumor about a competitor's illegitimacy could sway the court. A mysterious illness could silence a threat. Nothing in the harem was accidental. Everything had meaning. Every gesture was calculated. Beyond the harem, the royal court mirrored the same instability. High-ranking officials and generals vied for attention and favor. Promotions were often less about merit and more about loyalty, or the illusion of it. Secret pacts were made between advisors. Bribes changed hands. Even priests, supposedly the guardians of divine truth, engaged in power struggles. Some backed one queen, others another. Some interpreted omens to favor a specific heir. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined and often inseparable. To maintain control, the pharaoh had to become a master of perception. He had to show strength while hiding fear. He had to reward loyalty while watching for betrayal. At court, he smiled and spoke of harmony. But in private, he consulted spies, read secret reports, and sometimes ordered executions under the cover of night. A single misstep, a bad harvest, an ill-considered decree, a wrong word, could give his enemies the excuse they needed to move against him. Assassination plots were not unheard of. There were pharaohs who were poisoned, smothered in their sleep, or attacked during temple processions. And often their killers wore the mask of family. A wife who smiled beside him at dinner might later instruct her brother to move against him. A son raised in golden cradles might lead a coup in the dead of night. The throne was powerful, but it was also the most dangerous seat in the land. Yet through all of this, the silent wars, the ritualized betrayals, the unending suspicion, the pharaoh was expected to rule with grace, wisdom, and divine calm. He had to present an image of balance, of eternal stability. No matter how many secrets festered behind the palace walls, the people had to believe their god. King was untouched by chaos, but chaos lived with him. It dined at his table. It whispered through the silk curtains of the harem and echoed in the marble halls of the court. It waited patiently, wearing perfume and gold, smiling with a mouth full of lies. And so, even in a palace filled with luxury, surrounded by wives and servants, the pharaoh often found himself alone, more alone than the poorest farmer on the edge of the desert. For what good is a kingdom if every heart around you hides a knife? For most people in ancient Egypt, death was a mystery to fear or avoid. But for the pharaoh, death was something to prepare for from the moment he claimed the throne. It was not simply the end of life, but a transformation into something eternal. While his subjects lived for the harvest and the flood of the Nile, the pharaoh lived with one eye constantly fixed on the afterlife. His days were spent ruling, but his nights and his fortunes were consumed by the obsession of what came next. The construction of his tomb, the gathering of sacred texts, the crafting of funerary objects. These were not final acts, but lifelong duties. From the very beginning of his reign, one of the first things a pharaoh did was begin building his tomb. Sometimes this took the form of a grand pyramid, rising slowly above the desert sands, a visible stairway to the heavens. Other times, it was a hidden tomb carved deep into the Valley of the Kings, designed to evade tomb robbers and protect the body and soul for eternity. These projects were immense, involving thousands of workers, architects, artists, and priests. It could take decades to complete, and in some cases, the pharaoh died before his tomb was finished, leaving his successors to hastily complete the work. This wasn't just architecture. It was theology in stone. Every chamber, every hallway, every mural and carving had cosmic significance. The layout of the tomb mirrored the journey through the underworld. The walls were covered in spells and incantations from the asterisk book of the dead asterisk, asterisk Amjuat asterisk, or asterisk book of Gates asterisk, sacred texts meant to guide the pharaoh's soul past demons, serpents, and divine trials. He would encounter gods who weighed his heart, tested his truthfulness, and questioned his worth. These texts weren't just decorations. They were survival manuals for the afterlife. Inside the tomb, treasures were stored: gold, statues, food, weapons, perfumes, boats, games, and even miniature servants made of stone or wood, called asterisk Shabtis asterisk, who were expected to serve the pharaoh in the next world. Nothing was left to chance. If he liked something in this life, a certain style of chair, a favorite musical instrument, a prized necklace, it was replicated or buried with him. Even pets, including dogs and cats, might be sacrificed and mummified to accompany him beyond the grave. He was not going to enter the afterlife as a beggar, but as a king, and of course, the body itself had to be preserved. Mummification was a long, sacred, and disturbing process. Organs were removed, dried, and stored in special jars. The brain was pulled out through the nose, discarded as unimportant. The body was dehydrated, coated in resins and oils, and carefully wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen. Priests chanted spells over each layer. Amulets were inserted between the wrappings to protect the pharaoh from harm. His face might be covered with a golden mask, iconic, beautiful, and haunting, crafted to resemble him in life, yet stylized like a god. The process was invasive, graphic, and violent, but it was all in the name of preservation. To decay meant to disappear, to be forgotten, to lose one's place in eternity. The pharaoh had to be whole, recognized by the gods, prepared to rise again. Even his tomb was sealed in a ritual, with curses engraved to ward off intruders. His sarcophagus might be placed within multiple layers of nested coffins, each one carved with protection spells, prayers, and names. The deeper the burial, the greater the hope of escaping robbers and spiritual corruption. But what drove this obsession was not fear, it was control. The pharaoh had controlled the living world, and he sought to control death in the same way. He didn't accept the idea of disappearance. He demanded continuation. In his mind, the afterlife was not a ghostly haze, but a tangible kingdom, another Egypt perfected. He would rule there as he had ruled here, not as a fading soul, but as an eternal God, radiant and restored. He believed that his name would be spoken for thousands of years, that offerings would be made in his honor, that his monuments would defy time itself. Yet for all their power and planning, many pharaohs failed to escape time. Tomb robbers often looted the graves within decades of burial, sometimes even sooner. The riches they buried to ensure their eternal comfort were stolen, melted down, sold. Bodies were torn from sarcophagi, gold masks stripped away, sacred jars shattered. Priests who once bowed in reverence later repurposed offerings for other temples. Entire legacies vanished into the sand, and yet the pharaohs kept building, kept hoping. They still believed. Even the more hidden tombs were not truly safe. The Valley of the Kings, though concealed in cliffs and guarded by soldiers, eventually became a target itself. Some pharaohs attempted trickery, false doors, decoy passages, hidden chambers, but most of these measures failed. The afterlife, it seemed, was not only populated by spirits and gods, but also by very human greed. In time, many mummies were moved for safekeeping, stripped of their grandeur, and placed in storage by later dynasties, or discovered centuries later by archaeologists. What was once the divine flesh of Horus became a specimen behind glass, a skull to be studied, a relic passed from museum to museum. Their carefully crafted names, once sung in temples, became difficult to pronounce. Their monuments, once glowing in sunlight, eroded under desert winds. They had spent their lives preparing for an afterlife that no longer looked the way they imagined. Still, in their final preparations there is a strange beauty, a testament to belief taken to the furthest edge of human imagination. They may not have achieved immortality as they defined it, but in a way they succeeded. Thousands of years later, their lives, their deaths, and their haunting pursuit of eternity still capture our fascination. They feared being forgotten, and yet here we are, still whispering their names. Long after the golden age of the Pharaohs had crumbled, and the winds of the desert swept across their forgotten tombs, time began to unravel the legacy they fought so desperately to preserve. Their names, once etched in stone with divine reverence, faded. Their temples, once bursting with incense, chants, and offerings, stood silent, empty, broken. The gods they claimed to embody were slowly buried under the weight of newer empires, new religions, and changing civilizations. And yet the pharaohs remained, entombed beneath layers of earth and mystery, their bodies still waiting, still dreaming of eternity. For centuries they lay hidden. Some were left undisturbed, perfectly sealed in darkness. Others were violated by thieves who smashed their sarcophagi and scattered their bones, searching for gold and jewels to sell. The sacred was reduced to merchandise. Amulets were ripped from corpses. Sacred texts were torn apart, their meanings lost. The elaborate preparations meant to secure their afterlife were shredded by greed and ignorance. What had once been eternal now felt fragile, forgotten. Then came the modern world, with its curiosity, science, and the need to uncover the past. Archaeologists, explorers, and looters alike descended into the tombs of the pharaohs. Some were driven by awe and wonder, hoping to preserve history. Others came for fame, fortune, or national glory. They broke open tombs sealed for thousands of years. They unwrapped mummies by candlelight, slicing through linen with steel knives, exposing skin and bone that hadn't seen daylight since before Rome was born. What had been sacred was now spectacle. Bodies meant to be revered were stripped, examined, and catalogued. Skulls were measured, teeth were extracted, hair samples were taken. The pharaoh's body, once wrapped in gold, once prayed over by priests, was now placed on a metal table beneath the clinical lights of modern labs. The silence of eternity was replaced by the whir of machines, the scribble of pencils, the cold whisper of analysis. Even King Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous of them all, was lifted from his golden sarcophagus and X-rayed, scanned, debated over in documentaries and books. His death became a puzzle. His injuries, his bones, his malformed footage detail pulled apart and debated as if his body were no longer human, but merely a case file. And still, these rulers could not rest. They were shipped across countries, displayed behind glass in museums, exposed to the eyes of millions. People lined up to stare into the hollow sockets of men once believed to be gods. Photographs were taken, souvenirs were sold. The pharaoh's name, once spoken in holy prayer, was now printed on mugs and t-shirts. Their eternity had arrived, but not in the way they imagined. It was not an afterlife of glory and comfort. It was an afterlife of exposure, of examination, of being endlessly dissected by history and imagination. The gods they prayed to had long gone silent. Ra, Osiris, Anubis, these names were no longer part of sacred rituals, but myths studied in schoolbooks. Temples that once echoed with hymns now echoed with tour guides and camera shutters. The power they held in life, the fear they commanded, the awe they inspired, all of it had transformed into something smaller, almost tragic. They were no longer gods, they were curiosities, they were no longer eternal kings. They were skeletons on display, and yet there is something deeply unsettling in how they linger. Despite everything, despite the invasions, the decay, the theft, the disrespect, the pharaohs remain. Their faces, preserved in painted coffins or sculpted in stone, still stare forward with an eerie calm. Their names, though mispronounced and often misunderstood, are still spoken. Their stories are still told. They continue to fascinate, to haunt the collective imagination of the world. They may have been robbed of their original eternity, but they achieved a different kind of immortality, one rooted in human obsession, in our unending need to understand what came before us. What they could not have foreseen is that their legacy would be shaped not by priests or sons, but by strangers from lands they never knew existed, that their lives would be interpreted by scholars, painted in film, twisted into fantasy, that the rituals meant to preserve their souls would become historical curiosities, that people in faraway centuries would stand before their sarcophagi and wonder what it felt like to wear the crown, to walk in golden sandals, to fear eternity so deeply that death became a lifelong project. Some would argue that their obsession with the afterlife was a failure, that despite all their efforts, they did not escape death, nor preserve their kingdoms. But perhaps it's more complicated than that. Perhaps there is a strange success in being remembered at all. In a world where most are forgotten after a single generation, the pharaohs still have their names carved into the memory of the world. Not in the way they planned, not through rituals and offerings, but through fascination, film, and debate. Still, there is a quiet sorrow in their fate. These were men who ruled with absolute power, who lived surrounded by silence and fear, who were buried with all the riches their kingdoms could provide. And yet in the end their bones were displayed to strangers. Their treasures were taken, their dreams of eternal peace were replaced by endless exposure. Perhaps the deepest tragedy is this: they gave everything to be remembered as gods, only to be remembered as men.